Now, over time, little by little, all these dodgy reports kept piling up on David's desk, and they looked like pretty heinous war crimes.
I saw a lot of suspicious reports. The military investigator signed off on it and said, no problem, nothing to see here now.
All the incidents were already looked at. There was found to be insufficient evidence to support criminal charges. Uniformly. 730 made sensational headlines of war crimes, but independent investigator said the opposite.
But there were some really horrific things in there that David couldn't ignore, like the exploits of Australia's most decorated soldier, Ben Roberts-Smith.
Just to clear up any confusion, I did not leak the allegations against Ben Roberts-Smith.
He'd shot like a 10-year-old boy. When the Defence Force gave him a medal, they said they turned the one shepherd boy into a Taliban militia force trying to outflank the SAS position.
The awful fact of this is not only did defence chiefs fail to back a man who put his life on the line for Australia more times than can be counted, they deliberately leaked the story.
Let alone the damage to our soul. Imagine if you were a soldier and your life was ruined by the Persian inquiry.
Former military lawyer David McBride has been sentenced to 5 years and 8 months jail.
This is dangerous for democracy, and I'm not even going into the chilling effect it'll have on future whistleblowers.
David McBride.
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 How you doing? I'm a bread tuber now. David McBride is a British-Australian army lawyer for the SAS. He started his military career in the UK, commanding a Blues and Royals platoon. After leaving the army, he did some assorted work, like a security advisor for an Afghanistan documentary, a participant in a game show, and running for public office in Australia. He then joined the ADF as a military lawyer, before quickly becoming disaffected by how things were run. He noticed that members of leadership would do things for the sake of appearance, and to forward their own careers above all else. He describes the ADF as conducting an Instagram war in Afghanistan, where actions were taken to make the public happy rather than getting results. He deployed to Afghanistan twice, once in 2011 and once in 2013, serving with the Special Air Service Regiment. Alright, time out. We got to talk about the Special Forces. So you've got the ADF, the Australian Defence Force, then under that, there's Special Operations Command, which is an umbrella organisation that controls all of the Special Forces regiments. There's a lot of these, like the Commandos and the Special Air Service Regiment, more commonly known as the SAS. Now, this is the organisation that David worked for as a military lawyer. During these tours, David noticed troubling evidence of, let's be value neutral for now and say he noticed problems. David noticed problems within the SAS for which he wanted to file a complaint. Back in Australia, he began compiling a large brief of classified documents that provided evidence for his allegations, and made a formal complaint to the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force. So the IGADF is basically the FBI for the Defence Force. They conduct investigations into misconduct by members of the organisation, and crucially, they report to the Department of Defence and not the ADF directly, so they are independent of the chain of command. The IGADF looked into David's complaint, but dismissed it, finding that most of the allegations could not be substantiated. Disgruntled, David then tried getting his story heard through the media. He provided the documents to journalists Andrew Clark and Chris Masters, but they wouldn't bite. He then sent them to Dan Oakes of the ABC, who used the documents as part of his 7-part report, The Afghan Files, a damning look into alleged war crimes committed by the Special Forces and their investigations. While this was happening, the IGADF began their own inquiry, headed by Paul Legay Brereton, into allegations of war crimes. What followed were a series of media reports, recounting various accusations of war crimes. The work of all these journalists and whistleblowers was vindicated by this, the IGADF's Brereton Inquiry, a huge investigation into war crimes in the Special Forces, finding credible evidence of 39 murders. Back to David. As he had leaked classified documents without permission, the Australian Federal Police pressed charges, and was arrested in 2018. The AFP required evidence from the ABC, which they obtained from a raid of their headquarters, leading to this infamous moment.
And there's a raid happening right here at the ABC right now, just 100 metres or so that way.
After multiple delays to the legal proceedings, he eventually pled guilty in 2023 and was sentenced to 5 years and 8 months in jail. Wow, so the way I see it, there are 3 layers to McBride's narrative. Layer 1. David McBride leaked documents to expose war crimes. Pretty simple. But then, Layer 2, the ABC's Four Corners countered this narrative by claiming that actually...
He really simply wanted the story to say that the special forces in Afghanistan were being unfairly targeted and unfairly scrutinised and investigated when they shouldn't have been investigated. He never at any point, I believe, mentioned war crimes or showed any desire to uncover war crimes or have people punished for war crimes.
How different then is the story that you ended up pursuing?
Well, it was diametrically opposed, wasn't it? The more I looked into it, I couldn't conceive of how anyone would claim that these guys were being too tightly monitored. It was precisely the opposite.
According to the journalist that David leaked the documents to, his intentions were actually to prevent war crimes being investigated. He thought the SAS was under too much scrutiny, and thought that soldiers who killed civilians were being investigated when they shouldn't have been. Daniel disagreed, believing that the documents he gave him showed the exact opposite, that the SAS was not under enough scrutiny, and there were potential war crimes that were being dismissed too easily. This led to a falling out between the two, where Oakes published a story that David didn't like. But then, David's legal team, as long as alternative media like Friendly Geordies and my favourite YouTuber in the whole wide world, Boy, hit back with Layer 3. The story is more complicated than the ABC made it out.
A few weeks before he's sentenced to, prison, the ABC finally pipes up to release a hit piece on him. They made absurd claims that he actually wanted to cover up war crimes himself, and he somehow leaked all these incriminating documents by accident.
Put it simply, a bit too simply, as an army lawyer, McBride thought that he was being forced to investigate innocent soldiers in order to cover for guilty soldiers that were more favoured by command. Yes, David did defend soldiers wrongfully accused of war crimes. The other part of the shopping bag related to acts undertaken by Australian Special Forces that had been glossed over in sham reports. He knew that any intelligent reader, which Oakes was, would see their significance and would see the difference between improper prosecutions McBride was being asked to conduct and shocking acts that had been ignored by military command. They were both part of the same problem in McBride's view.
Basically, they claim that while it is true that David thought that some soldiers were being unfairly investigated, he also believed that other soldiers were committing war crimes which defense was covering up, where the former was being used as a smokescreen for the latter. He thought that defense launched these vexatious investigations so that the public would think that they were dealing with the issue, while actual war crimes went down unseen. And we have proof that this is what David believed. The Guardian published an affidavit that he wrote back in 2021. Afghan civilians were being murdered, and Australian military leaders were at the very least turning the other way, and at worst, tacitly approving this behaviour. At the same time, soldiers were being improperly prosecuted as a smokescreen to cover leadership's inaction and failure to hold reprehensible conduct to account. And yeah, fair enough, you can't lie on a sworn affidavit. That would be perjury, so the ABC was wrong. David did in fact attempt to expose war crimes. Alright, thanks for watching. But now he's been sentenced, we can read the final court judgment to get some extra details on his case. Let's have a look at the war crimes he uncovered, as well as these vexatious investigations. Okay, so here's him talking to a supervisor about the investigations he thought shouldn't have happened. I guess they'll get to the war crimes later. His complaint to the IGADF. I guess I'll talk about it there. No, that's just more about the vexatious investigations. Okay, maybe it was in a separate complaint. Ever since the Jedi Council, what is bro yapping about?
Take a seat, young Skywalker.
What a silly, silly thing. So, if we keep going, I guess they'll get to the war crimes he wanted to expose later. And that's it. Oh. There is not a single mention of a war crime that David tried to expose. There is an extensive account of investigations that David thought were too overzealous, including a complaint to his superior, a complaint to the AFP, and of course his complaint to the IGADF. And while they don't give the whole thing, we can see the titles of each chapter and a detailed summary of each. Here's how he concluded the complaint. All army units have been under extreme scrutiny. Unpalatable as those allegations were, they involved a handful of people, and any similar-sized organization would have had similar in recent years. I believe the overzealous investigations of the Special Forces in 2013 were driven by appearance rather than suspicion of a crime. Yeah, if he did think that there were war crimes that were being covered up, he didn't report it to the IGADF. And this information, it's not just something that the prosecution are saying to attack him. It's in the agreed statement of facts, the information that both parties agreed to be true. And if you still don't trust that, try David McBride's own legal team. Counsel for McBride submitted that his motivation in engaging in the offending conduct was honourable in that he honestly believed that there was misconduct within the ADF with respect to the conduct of the Defence Force investigations of Special Forces soldiers in 2013. This is where his legal counsel was trying to argue that his sentence should be reduced because his intentions were honourable. And if that's the case, you'd think they'd include exposing war crimes as honourable intentions. They also argued that it advanced the public interest as it led to the publication of the Afghan files. However, Justice David Mossop points out that David's intentions were the exact opposite of what Dan Oakes wrote, i.e. the articles published exposed war crimes, but David didn't want that. But it's not just Dan saying this, no. If you'll remember, there were two other journalists who David gave the documents to. There's Andrew Clark, who's been pretty silent on this, and Chris Masters, who wrote this excellent book, which I'll be referring back to a lot. He has a whole chapter on David McBride, and he corroborates Dan's story, also saying that David's only intention was to protect soldiers being unfairly investigated. He also mentions that he only came to his new anti-war crime position much later on. So to recap, the statement of facts extensively documents David McBride's intentions, showing no evidence that he wanted to expose war crimes, with the judge agreeing as such, his own legal team making submissions that don't bring up war crimes, two journalists who David spoke to saying that exposing war crimes wasn't his intention. And you expect me to believe that both these journalists are lying, and the judge is supposedly excluding this vital information from the final court judgment. And his legal team never kicked a fuss about any of this? Okay, look, if you're following this case, you're probably screaming at me to mention this. What about the documents that David wasn't allowed to use as evidence?
But there was also a last-minute public interest immunity application from the Department of Defence, meaning that evidence that potentially exonerated David McBride was removed at the whim of the government.
And Boy managed to warp the truth that specific evidence was suppressed that McBride believed was important to...
But it wasn't a normal trial where, you can defend yourself, right? It was the other kind of trial where the judge turns to you and says, sorry, mate, the Americans said the evidence you're using for your defense isn't actually allowed for national security reasons. So we've decided you have to defend yourself with zero evidence.
Zero evidence? Well, David Mossop made his decision regarding this public. And honestly, it's pretty reasonable. All these documents were allowed as evidence, just in redacted form. McBride's legal team wanted them fully unredacted. There's also another thing I hear people say about this.
It was removed at the whim of the government, and from what I've heard, this was without the judge. I have to emphasize this. The fucking judge even seeing the evidence.
The judge was the one who reviewed the request, and while he was allowed to view the documents, he just chose not to. He had enough evidence to make a decision based on affidavits of people who had seen the documents. But let's go through these individually. There were 8 documents, with 7 being discussed here. The first 3 surround a man named Sergeant Hekmatullah, whose special forces were attempting to capture. Like I said, McBride had access to these documents, just in redacted form. And in his submission, he doesn't really articulate why he thinks the unredacted portion is significant. He just states that it is. That's going to be a theme for these submissions. Next is a message sent by a person whose name is redacted, and this is where we get to another claim you may have heard.
The Australian government is removing evidence because a foreign government wants them to. And you would have to be an idiot to not know which foreign government we're talking about here.
This is a lot less conspiratorial than people are making it out to be. The evidence was requested to be redacted by the Australian government, not the foreign partner, which, is probably America. They shared information with us, and we are treaty-bound to not share this classified information with anyone else, which is why they basically vouched for the request. However, that doesn't mean the court isn't allowed to reveal it anyway. It just means it will be taken into account in the decision, and can be overruled if there's a good reason to do so. But once again, David's team did not provide a reason why they wanted it unredacted. The next 2 are basically the same thing. The document is classified by a foreign partner who vouched for the request, and David wants them fully unredacted and does not have a good reason why. Now this last one is very interesting, but we'll get back to it later. But just for now, trust me that it was also pretty reasonable. But okay, let's assume that all these redactions were bullshit, and they did actually hurt his case. None of that changes the fact that the court judgment clearly lays out the fact that he did not intend to expose war crimes. These are omissions of classified documents, not a suppression of David's intentions, or the existence of like a formal complaint or whatever. Is it possible that the judge is just lying and intentionally omitting this information? Look, the idea that a judge is maliciously biased against one party to the point where they do something like that is an incredibly bold claim that you'd need evidence for. But the thing is, there is no evidence for that. And to be honest, to generate any credibility to that claim, it kind of seems like David and his team are trying to smear him.
That meant that David had to sit there for 2.5 hours and listen to the things that were said about him by the judge, which seemed to me to go beyond a strictly professional and dispassionate judgment that I would expect from a Supreme Court judge, straying into personal areas, even attacking his father, Dr. William McBride.
Now, in case you didn't know, his father, William McBride, was a famed obstetrician who exposed the dangers of the drug thalidomide, but then destroyed his reputation and got struck off the medical register for fabricating data in another study. If David Mossop attacked his father, he probably deserved it.
To the callous remarks made about David's daughters being at an age where they didn't need him anymore.
Mossop was just pointing out the fact that his daughters are of an age where they would no longer be adversely affected by the absence of a father, in the way an actual child would, and would justify a shorter sentence.
Things like his psych report were noted but discounted. Detail about how David would not do well in prison and being separated from his support animal with his medical conditions, that was just discounted and dismissed.
Yeah, if you've seen interviews with David, his PTSD clearly does not affect him that much. And if you think it does, why would you trust him to leak classified documents? Putting all this together, when his team are willing to say things like that, while also picking apart quotes from the judgment, and constantly complaining about the evidence that was redacted, if there was vital information about David's intentions that were not in the judgment, you'd think they'd kick a fuss about it. There are some other weird things about this case too. Here's a quick timeline of events. First, David tried to request immunity under the Public Interest Disclosure Act. This is basically what people mean when they say whistleblower laws. Basically, he was going to argue that his case should be dropped because his disclosure was made in the public interest. He then dropped that defense after realizing it would not be feasible. So he instead moved to argue that it was his duty as a soldier to act in the Australian public interest. He wanted to interpret the definition of duty that a soldier in the ADF had as to include a duty to act in the Australian public interest. The judge rejected this submission, so, absent his two main defenses, he was forced to plead guilty. Now, him dropping the PID claim is pretty strange to me. This seems like by far his strongest defense. And if he did intend to expose war crimes, all he would have to do is explain that to a judge and he'd have a pretty good chance of having his charges dropped. Well, according to his legal team, it's because the testimony of 2 expert witnesses were quashed. Wait, that's it? That's enough to drop his best defense? Even if it might make it a bit harder, it's still worth a go without them. And plus, seeing his lack of justification for needing those other documents, I wouldn't expect his explanation for needing this as evidence to be any better. However, despite all this, there was still something hanging over my head, and it might be hanging over yours too. What was it with this affidavit that clearly states that David wanted to expose war crimes? You can't lie on a sworn affidavit. How do you reconcile this? There is a way. And no, I don't think he committed perjury. Keep watching and I'll explain later. Okay, so where else can we look? Well, if you want to understand war crimes, you gotta understand war criminals. So let's talk about Ben Robert Smith. Ben Robert Smith was a corporal in the SAS who hosted an impressive career, earning a Medal for Gallantry in 2006 and the Victoria Cross in 2011, giving him the reputation as Australia's most decorated soldier. But this all came crashing down thanks to the work started by investigative journalist Chris Masters, who was embedded with the Special Forces. He, along with the help of Fairfax's Nick McKenzie, collected testimony and evidence that they used in a damning series of reports, alleging that Ben Robert Smith had both committed and encouraged acts of murder against Afghan civilians and detainees. Among his more colourful exploits, it was uncovered that he machine-gunned a man to death before stealing his prosthetic leg to be used as a drinking glass. Robert Smith denied these allegations and launched a defamation case against Fairfax. However, after a 110-day trial, Justice Bosenko ruled that the claims published in the articles were substantially true, forcing Robert Smith to pay upwards of $30 million in legal costs to prove that he was a war criminal. YouTuber Boy Boy interviewed McBride, and according to him, David was onto Ben Robert Smith while he was in the SAS.
There were some really horrific things in there that David couldn't ignore, like the exploits of Australia's most decorated soldier, Ben Robert Smith.
Okay, maybe I was wrong. He even has a story to tell about his antics.
Back in 2006, in Ben Robert Smith's sort of first major medal, he'd shot like a 10-year-old boy unarmed, and other SAS people said, "What the fuck are you doing?" And they were meant to be hidden away in a silent, unseen overwatch, and he gave his position away by killing this guy that the other SAS soldiers said was just a shepherd boy minding his own business. And then other people came out, probably villagers of the town, and they shot all them as well. And he got a medal for it. And when the Defence Force gave him a medal, they said they turned the one shepherd boy into a Taliban militia force trying to outflank the SAS position. Now, that Ben Robert Smith didn't write that. You know, the Defence Department wrote that.
Right, to cover
because to make him the hero.
This is actually not the first time David has told the story.
They knew Robert Smith was good copy back in 2006. Now, he shot a shepherd boy, apparently unarmed, said he was a spotter. So the SAS people that observed him said he hadn't seen them. And yet the Australians write it up as he's a Taliban anti-coalition militia trying to outflank them.
Wow, so not only did Ben kill a shepherd's boy, he killed villagers who came out after, and senior members of defence covered it up. Big if true, shocking. Now, the thing you have to understand about this is... Oh, sorry, that's just my phone. It's a little old. It usually takes about 6 years for messages to come through. Let's have a look. Oh, it's a tweet from David McBride in 2019. He's linked an article about Ben Robert Smith. The awful fact of this is not only did defence chiefs fail to back a man who put his life on the line more times than can be counted, they deliberately leaked the story to distract the news cycle from my allegations against them. Australia's most decorated soldier, Ben Robert Smith, tells potential recruits not to join the armed forces, as the war hero calls for military's top brass to be sacked.
On the allegation against Ben Robert Smith, now that is just an allegation, and I said it's extremely, from what I've seen, the accounts are second or third hand. Christian Porter could keep Jake tied up for years just on suspicion, and that's what they tend to do with journalists and myself, people like Ben Robert Smith.
Oh. So let me get this straight. He was arrested in 2018. In 2019, he was a fan of Ben Robert Smith while calling the accusations against him pub rumours, and alleged that defence deliberately leaked the accusations against him. But now in 2024, not only is he saying that he committed war crimes, but he's saying that senior members of defence covered it up by fabricating a report. Okay, so maybe he changed his mind in light of new evidence. So, is this new story true? Nope. Do you know why we know that? Because remember, there was a court case about this. Oh god. Yes, it is true that an unarmed person was shot. Whether he was an adult or not is contentious, but that's beside the point. However, McBride said that after that, more civilians came out and Ben killed them too. That didn't happen. There was an actual group of militants who came out after. This was completely uncontroversial during the trial. However, his most egregious error is his claim that senior leadership and the Defense Department fabricated information to cover this up. Yes, after the battle, information in a report was falsified. It claimed that the person had an AK-style weapon when they were really unarmed. However, this wasn't written by defense, it was written by someone on the patrol. Where did he get this from? Was the original reporting wrong before the court case? Nope. Here is the original article that started this all, written by Nick McKenzie using information from Chris Masters' book. It does not contradict the fact that there was battle and says nothing about civilians being killed after. Also never says that defense changed a report. It does say that the incident with the teenager was excluded from the citation, but remember, information was falsified by someone on the patrol. So whoever wrote the citation was under the assumption that the teenager was just another combatant, so bringing that up wasn't really noteworthy. But you know what's so funny? In this thread where he is wrongly making these claims, he cites that very article that contradicts him. The way he talks about it is so dishonest. Here he is relaying a quote from the article. The most scathing part of the complaint is not aimed at Robert Smith, though, who had nothing to do with the citation, but the unarmed senior officers who compiled it, and provides screenshots of the article that talk about the 2006 Chura Pass incident. The problem is this quote is not from any of these screenshots, because it's about a completely separate incident in 2012. David states his position about defense falsifying information, then shows a quote to make you think that the article is supporting his position, when in reality, this quote is referring to the time when Ben Robert Smith got his Commendation for Distinguished Service, and whoever wrote the citation exaggerated his accomplishments by leaving out times where the mission was bungled up pretty badly. This is obviously bad, but is a far cry from saying that defense covered up the murder of a civilian. Also keep in mind that this article was written in 2017, 2 years before David was calling the allegations against Ben Robert Smith pub rumours, and the journalist who wrote the article was motivated by a desire to expose a famous person. Man, back when I was trying to find his old social media posts to see if he's changed his mind on any of this, I was checking his really old socials, and while I found some weird stuff, I just assumed that if he did change his mind, he would have just deleted any evidence of that. But I didn't think he'd leave stuff up on his current account in 2019. Okay, so what else can we find? Well, just like acclaimed journalist Tyler Oliveira, I decided to investigate. I went through old interviews, his entire YouTube channel, and every single tweet between 2016 and 2021. I need friends. I need friends. I need something to do other than this. Does anyone want to be my friend? Look, I've extensively documented this in my sources, so if you ever think I'm misrepresenting him or leaving anything out, you can go check that to verify. Alright, let's begin. David used to have some thoughts about the Brereton inquiry. If you'll remember, it was an investigation that found credible evidence of 39 murders. David claims that all the incidents were already looked into, and there was insufficient evidence to support criminal charges. Yeah, if you still don't think he wanted to expose war crimes, here he is in his own words saying that there was not enough evidence for them. And when asked about the Afghan files, the articles supposedly where the crimes he wanted to expose were published, he just complains about how the incidents were just mistakes or tragic accidents.
What is it about the coverage that upsets you, though?
It was such a predictable non-story. A group of SAS soldiers shot a farm boy hiding behind some rocks. They obviously mistakenly thought he was an insurgent. Now that's not great, but it's hardly the crime of the century.
You say it's hardly the worst thing that could happen, but there was an implication that some of these incidents were deliberate or negligent. Were any of those incidents resolved through the military courts or in other ways?
They attempted it, but I'm glad you brought that up, because here's a really good point. With all that froth and bubble and all the scrutiny the Australian forces have had in the 10 years they're in Afghanistan, you know how many convictions for wrongful death we've had of soldiers? 0. So the idea that there were some sort of killing machines was just such a hack piece of journalism.
He also has some interesting ideas.
Deaths were good for their popularity. Going to funerals made people think that they were statesmanlike, whereas if we had battles with the Taliban, that didn't cause them any popularity. They did a subconscious deduction and said, dead soldiers good, dead Taliban bad.
David, to be clear, you're saying that the politicians tightened the rules of engagement in order to put their own troops at a disadvantage, so more of them would die, so that when they attended the funerals, they would then create a swell of patriotic pride, which lifted their own ratings amongst the public.
Yep, that's it.
At the extreme end of his theory, McBride argued the government amplified the rules of engagement for Australian soldiers, knowing it could increase the risk to their lives, but that politicians were content to do this because attending soldiers' funerals would look good on television and boost their approval ratings. Jesus. Dan Oakes wrote an article about investigators travelling to Afghanistan to speak to witnesses of war crimes. Seems pretty important, right? David says that speaking to witnesses means nothing. He even said that the Afghan files made sensational headlines of war crimes, despite an independent investigator saying the opposite. But going back to his complaints about the IGADF inquiry, he had concerns around how these investigations could ruin soldiers' lives.
If we couldn't do an inquiry into things that have already been looked into in 5 years, how are we going to go against the Chinese army? So it has no judicial quality to it at all. He can't recommend he can recommend that someone be investigated, but it will be written by the military who have got it in for the SAS. It's totally disingenuous for the government to say it's going to achieve anything. It's just all kind of rumour and gossip. It's not a police investigation. Imagine if you were a soldier and your life was ruined by the Brereton inquiry.
Well, this is done for a pretty good reason. There's lots of rumours and accusations, and the IGADF doesn't want to waste the police's time with things that aren't true. The inquiry found a lot of credible evidence, yes, but it also found allegations that couldn't be substantiated, which has the effect of exonerating the soldiers involved. Isn't that what David wants? Man, for years I've heard that this guy is some great warrior of truth, exposing war crimes gone unseen, and now I am explaining to him why investigating potential war crimes is a good thing. And yeah, this process is slow, but it's sped up by doing things at the same time. Some federal police investigations were going on while the IGADF did theirs. David complains about the Ben Robert Smith allegations being dealt with by the media and not the police. However, at the time that he posted this, the police were investigating him. And while the AFP won't tell us about everyone they're investigating, we at least know about, of course, Ben, but also Oliver Scholes, who was actually charged.
On the allegation against Ben Robert Smith, now that is just an allegation. From what I've seen, the accounts are second or third hand. I won't say any more about that. Maybe they've got better witnesses, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe they have better witnesses than that. You could have tried checking, like literally the first line in this article. An Australian Special Forces soldier kicked a handcuffed Afghan detainee off a cliff before endorsing his summary execution, according to allegations made by direct witnesses. I have no idea why he thinks the journalists' lawyers don't have first-hand witnesses. You can read Chris Masters' book. He talks about all of the witnesses he interviewed before publishing the articles. Also, you might remember from earlier when David had a theory that the allegations against Ben Robert Smith were intentionally leaked by defense. He also claims that another document, the Crumfits Report, was intentionally leaked to Chris Masters as well. Now, the Crumfits Report, written by sociologist Samantha Crumfits, was actually what started the Brereton inquiry. It was intended simply as an investigation into culture in the Special Forces, but through private interviews she conducted with the soldiers, things were a lot darker than they seemed. Her findings were then forwarded to the IGADF, who began the full investigation. So does David have any evidence that any of this was intentionally leaked? No, not really. He just points out the fact that the journalists and sources for these stories weren't prosecuted, but he was, and then concludes that that means that defense leaked the information intentionally. I have a couple more, slightly more plausible explanations for this. A, the testimony against Ben Robert Smith and the Crumfits Report were not classified information, but what he leaked was. And B, they had a good reason to leak the information and David did not. Chris Masters actually addresses this in his book. I can say with complete certainty that Samantha Crumfits did not leak her report, nor was it made available to us by defense leadership. I trust Chris when he says this. He doesn't work for defense, his reporting on Ben Robert Smith was proven in court, and has never shown any signs of dishonesty. David, on the other hand, has. But to be fair, he has provided some proof that this has happened.
But he worked at somewhere called the Select Strategic Incident Management Cell. That is a cell that was created that, amongst other things, leaked documents. And they got found out by a Fairfax newspaper, Freedom of Information grab. They leaked about Ben Robert Smith because they were trying to take the heat off themselves. They leaked about the Crumfits inquiry.
If you read the Herald article that he's referring to, it doesn't really seem like it's saying what he thinks it does. I think what they mean is the ADF was planning to transparently give information to third parties who would communicate to the public on their behalf. It doesn't seem like this was a plan to covertly leak information to the press, then pretends like it was an unauthorized disclosure made by a whistleblower. And that doesn't really make any sense anyway. Why would they approve the Herald's Freedom of Information request if this was supposed to be a secret plan that no one was supposed to know about? But even if that was what they're planning, that doesn't mean it's also the case for Ben Robert Smith and the Crumfits Report. Once again, we have good reason to believe that they were not deliberately leaked. If they wanted the press to see the Crumfits Report, why would they deny their Freedom of Information request for it? But moving on from Ben Robert Smith, let's address his core argument, those killings he thought shouldn't have been investigated. Luckily, from his court case, we have a list of all these incidents. And from the Afghan files, we can get some details about them. Now, David really likes to attack these articles.
The Afghan files, which used my information or misused my information, said the absolute opposite. They said all the problems of the war in Afghanistan were caused by corporals, privates, people shot by mistake on patrol. The 7:30 report totally canned it and turned it upside down. It's because they don't have a problem with the story. It's almost like the ABC said they're collaborators. Have you ever seen the ABC run a story which is not in accordance with what the government wants?
Our friend Boy has said something similar.
And what the ABC ended up doing with it was unfortunate, right? Like, instead of a story of like corruption at the highest levels of government, they turned it into like a cultural issue. A story about how a group of bad boy soldiers had become desensitized and hyped each other up to murder innocent people.
But I don't think he's actually read them, because this is a terrible framing. There's less focus on the war crimes themselves and more on the investigations that preceded them. Dan Oakes talks extensively about the assessments of dead civilians, where the possibility of murder is usually brushed off very quickly. Let's start with the two shootings of detainee incidents on the 3rd of October 2010 and the 23rd of September 2013. I'm going to focus on the 2013 one because we have more information on it, but the other one is fairly similar.
An SAS soldier had captured a Taliban person, and then the Taliban person made a grab for the SAS soldier's weapon. Eventually, the SAS guy got his finger on the trigger, pulled the trigger, and shot the guy dead.
And we reported it. There was nothing suspicious about it. The Taliban guy, and he was Taliban, was shot dead. We investigated this guy with a vengeance to try to put him in jail for murder.
So a soldier was alone with a detainee, and according to him, he tried to grab his weapon, and so he shot him in self-defense. Then, based on this account, he was cleared of wrongdoing by a quick assessment. However, there were no witnesses. We don't really know that he told the truth, which is why the Australian Defence Force Investigative Service, the ADFIS, did an investigation just to double check. They asked to see the weapon he used, and then the commanding officer of the Special Operations Task Group, on the advice of the defence lawyer assigned to the task group, by the way, that defence lawyer was none other than David McBride. This is where it gets murky. They refused because the warrant issued the wrong offence, and David himself was investigated for obstructing an investigation. And to be fair, he was right that the warrant was faulty, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with investigating a potential murder just to double check the soldier wasn't lying. Now let's talk about the 26th of September incident, where Special Forces, allegedly, shot a man in self-defense who pointed a pistol at them, but then tragically, his son got caught in the crossfire.
That was a case where we shot a child in 2013, September 2013.
Someone was sitting on top of a rooftop and he made legitimate concern that it was an insurgent. That's not a murder, that's a mistake.
Assuming the story is true, it wouldn't be a crime, just an unfortunate accident. However, the man's cousin says that he wasn't armed and he was just sleeping with his son. And so there is legitimate grounds to doubt the soldier's story and launch an investigation. Next one is an absolute classic, the hand story.
For example, remember the case where a soldier cut off a hand of a dead Taliban in order to get the fingerprint evidence to work out whether this Taliban was the bomb maker that they were looking for. And they said that was the worst thing that had ever happened. And it wasn't even a crime.
And they treated that as if it was the worst thing that ever happened. It's not a crime. It wasn't a crime then. They did it in order to identify whether this person was a bomb maker.
A member of the SAS cut off the hand of dead Taliban members to collect their fingerprints. He did this because there was time pressure to get back to the helicopter, and taking the fingerprints there would have taken too long. This is obviously not some evil act. However, body mutilation is still a war crime, and so this is a morally complicated situation. Whether this is okay was contentious, and certain experts sanctioned it before it happened. Ultimately, new guidelines clarified that any type of body mutilation was not permitted. So yeah, this was a morally complicated situation, and I don't see a problem with it being investigated to straighten things out. Finally, the 28th of February incident.
They also wanted to put the guy who directed an Apache helicopter to fire a legitimate target, and the Apache helicopter got the wrong target. They wanted to put him in jail. There was an unfortunate incident about boys on donkeys, and an SAS soldier, they asked for fire support from an American helicopter. There was two groups of boys. The grids were different.
The US pilot of the Apache
was confused about the grid reference and he shot a different target.
I don't have anything specific to say about this, but once again, I don't see a problem with defense double-checking that a killing of a civilian was not a war crime. On top of these investigations, David had one other complaint, the amplification of the rules of engagement. Now, the rules of engagement is a document that sets out the circumstances where soldiers can open fire. It needs to be permissive enough to not endanger the lives of combatants, while restrictive enough to limit the risk to civilian life. Obviously, if your life is in immediate danger, you can't be blamed for making a mistake. But outside of that, things get more complicated. Squirters are people who appear to be moving quickly away from objects of interest, and shooting them can be justified if there is reason to believe that they are secret combatants. There are also spotters, a similar classification. The problem is that soldiers were interpreting these concepts in the vaguest way possible, such that almost any killing of civilians could be justified as actively participating in hostilities. Take for example this incident, where 3 unarmed men were killed. One was hiding in a pile of chaff, while another was hiding in a haystack. Well, that seems like spotter behaviour. The third was running away. Must be moving to gain a tactical advantage. That's a squirter. The men involved were cleared after the inquiry officer determined they acted in a manner consistent with taking a direct part in hostilities. But to be clear, this wasn't always done to cover up war crimes. A lot of the time, soldiers just didn't want to attract scrutiny from above, so they would use boilerplate language that would make leadership happy. It wasn't until later that we realised this practice was used for more insidious reasons. This still concerned the ADF, so in 2013, General Hurley made it clear that troops must have a good justification if they are going to kill civilians, and a clarification of the row was issued. Now, David has a problem with this.
They put out this thing called the Rules of Engagement Amplification, rubber stamped 2013 by General Hurley. They also changed the rules of engagement. They also started throwing around things like you could be guilty of murder if you follow the rules of engagement, and that wasn't true.
Because they had like a 7-step test for a soldier in a firefight with the Taliban as to when he could pull the trigger.
They were throwing far too many tests on rules of engagement for a battle. This is when bullets are flying around. And at the end of it, they said, if you don't do any of these 6 things, you go to jail for murder.
As we've been through, this isn't true. These incidents did not relate to situations in the middle of a firefight, but when soldiers' lives were not directly in danger, and they had time to think things through. Plus, this wasn't a change to the row, it was just David Hurley enforcing the current row more strictly. I don't see a problem with the ADF making sure that soldiers have a good reason to kill civilians. And yeah, you might be thinking, well, you're not a military lawyer, you haven't seen any of these documents, what do you know? And yeah, that's true. But the thing is, no one who has seen these documents agrees with him, seriously. He took this to the AFP, who found no evidence of a criminal offence. The IGADF also couldn't substantiate his complaints. The Brereton inquiry thought the SAS was under too little scrutiny, and thought the amplification of the rules of engagement was a good idea. Then of course, both Dan Oakes and Chris Masters disagreed with him, and I haven't heard from the third journalist he leaked documents to, Andrew Clark, but considering the fact that he didn't want to publish the documents, I can assume he also doesn't agree with him. Alright, before we continue, I gotta address something. We need to talk about the Jedi Council scandal. David McBride has frequently criticised Defence's handling of an affair known as the Jedi Council scandal.
I think you were talking it up, the Jedi Council scandal, so you could look good, and you needed some people to look really bad. That Defence Force, again in highly bad faith, pursued some of these people when they left Defence and tried to start new lives overseas. In one case, painted someone as a dangerous sexual predator, which was very far from the truth. He'd received an obscene email.
He made this terribly great speech about how this was the worst thing he'd ever seen, ever. An obscene email trail to do with his consensual sex escapades.
He says that Defence exaggerated what was just an obscene email trail and about a video of consensual sex. Unsavoury, yes. Meriting a national media conference before the trials, no. So was he right? Was this all just overblown and not really that bad? Former Commando and Jedi Council member Hastings Fredrickson pleads guilty to sharing sex photos. Oh no. In 2010, the offender, Hastings Fredrickson, was employed as a civilian contractor with Thales International. At the time of the offences, the offender was part of a group of male persons that called themselves the Jedi Council. The offender emailed a number of emails to the Jedi Council regarding his sexual exploits. The offender engaged in conversation and exchanged contact details with a female person he later referred to by the codename Melbourne Mistress or Melbourne Mole No. 5. During the course of the sexual relationship, the offender set up a camera and filmed their sexual acts. She did not know that the acts were being filmed and did not consent to the filming. Oh God.
To do with his consensual sex escapades.
Both engaged in consensual sexual activity with the offender, neither of them knew or consented to being filmed or photographed, and neither of them knew or consented to the dissemination of the photographs. Hold on, David. How can you film someone without their consent and have it be consensual?
This is outrageous. It's unfair.
The email was entitled The Footage, with an attachment to the email entitled The Wolf of Woolloomooloo. The verbal content of the emails described various forms of sexual activity, contained imputations or direct statements that the women involved were of loose morality or dubious character. The term moles and sluts were used, and open to promiscuous sexual activity. They were insulting, degrading, and humiliating descriptions of women, and not only expressing the triumph of a sexual contest, but belittling the objects of those conquests. Look, it's possible that David just didn't know any of this, but Fredrickson was convicted years before he's been saying any of this stuff, but he's presenting this as an important part of his case that he's not only well informed on, but also involved in.
The whole thing was a PR front, and yes, I may have some inside information about that. And yes, I do have some written documents which back up what I say. They're already on file.
So at the very least, he's lying about how much he knows about this. And he really shouldn't have to say how incredibly irresponsible it is to present yourself as a defense insider while confidently spreading misinformation about a subject this sensitive. This is the impact statement of the person Mr. Fredrickson called Melbourne Mole No. 5. She speaks of wishing to have a normal life and relationship, but being devoid of trust of persons. She speaks of previously being a normal, happy, outgoing person, but is now struggling in most aspects of her life. She speaks of suffering severe distress, being extremely upset, anxious, stressed, and angry. She became self-critical and questioned her own self-worth. She says she felt stupid because of what happened to her and has almost lost complete trust in men. The second victim said she needed to see a psychologist and psychiatrist because of this. And this isn't something that David just used to talk about. No. He's been talking about this as late as October 2023.
They leaked when there was a scandal. They leaked the home addresses of some people involved in the scandal to the media so the media could go and paparazzi them. And the guy ended up trying to kill himself, and it was only about an obscene email trail.
This is all very funny considering the fact that he called out defense for not dealing with rape culture in the ADF. But we can look more into why he had a problem with how defense handled the scandal. In light of these allegations, Chief of the Army David Morrison made a statement that was posted on YouTube. It then went viral and got 1 million views in less than a month. And honestly, it's a pretty good speech.
Those who think that it is okay to behave in a way that demeans or exploits their colleagues have no place in this army. On all operations, female soldiers and officers have proven themselves worthy of the best traditions of the Australian Army. They are vital to us maintaining our capability now and into the future. If that does not suit you, then get out.
David, however, has a problem with it.
General David Morrison, who was the Chief of the Army, who made that very famous speech where he said, "Get out," I allege was a complete lie based on a fabrication to make him look good.
The whole speech was a fraud in that the tape that was meant to be leaked was deliberately leaked, and that you were never actually meant to be talking to the Australian Army. The whole thing was a PR front. There is a record that you met with General Morrison before he made his speech, which I believe was highly illegal because it prejudiced the trials and it misrepresented the facts, and it did so in order to make Morrison look good.
Firstly, he claims that defense lied and said that the speech was leaked by a soldier. It seems like he's trying to say that it was deliberately leaked, like he claimed with the Ben Robert-Smith allegations or the Crumfits report. However, it wasn't. It did go viral, and it was posted to the Army's official YouTube channel. I have no idea what he's talking about. I can't find anywhere defense claiming that the speech was leaked.
Prejudicing the trials was completely out of order. That's why the police don't hold press conferences before we've had a trial. They're not allowed to. It would mean the alleged perpetrator would go free. If you really hated them as much as you said you did, you never would have done that, because you actually gave them a free pass in that they could have said, we can't be put on trial now. Under our system of law in Australia, you're entitled to a fair trial, and it is not for the prosecutor or people on behalf of the prosecutor to hold a national press conference and say what happened before you've had a trial.
Okay, look, I am not a lawyer. I do not know the circumstances where talking about an investigation would prejudice the trials. However, Morrison does say in the speech that he's limited in what he can say.
There are limits to how much I can tell you because the investigations into this network by both the New South Wales Police and the ADF Investigative Service are ongoing.
He is also careful to avoid the specifics of what sexually explicit material was disseminated.
But evidence collected to date has identified a group of men within our ranks who have allegedly produced highly inappropriate material, demeaning women, and distributed it across the internet and Defence's email networks.
But most importantly, if the speech did make the trial impossible, why did the guy plead guilty? If it was impossible to prosecute him because of this, why didn't he walk free? The Get Out speech wasn't actually written by General Morrison. It was written by Kate McGregor, a former army captain who is now a political commentator, who does a lot of appearances on Sky News. You know, I wonder what she thinks of David McBride, the man who called the speech she wrote a stage-managed lie.
But there is a serious risk that one man may go to jail. And he's not accused of war crimes. He's actually a very good friend of mine. I need to disclose that. And he's a very decent human being. His name's David McBride.
Oh dear. To be clear, while it's not true that the Get Out speech was some conspiracy to make defence leadership look good, that does not mean you can't criticise Defence's handling of the situation. The New South Wales Police said that Defence failed to cooperate with them during the investigations, and David Morrison knew this 11 months before going public. The problem is that David can't agree with this criticism, because it shows that this was serious and wasn't just overblown by Defence to bolster Morrison's career. Alright, let's get back on track. Quick recap. Both the journalists Chris Masters and Dan Oakes both said that David did not wish to expose war crimes. His final court judgment extensively details every time he thought that an investigation should not have taken place, but makes no mention of a war crime he wished to expose. He has old tweets saying that all the incidents in the Brereton report were already looked at and were already dismissed. And he invented a conspiracy about Ben Robert-Smith's allegations being deliberately leaked to the media. But, as it turns out, I might have been wrong. Turns out there is a war crime that David calls out during this period.
Is that in 2009, February 2009, another soldier who was not SAS killed 5 children. 5 children with a grenade, and he knew they were there, he could hear them screaming. And it went to court, it was fact. And the military judge, who probably had a lot of pressure put on them, acquitted this person effectively, killed 5 children with a grenade after he heard them screaming. That's not being investigated by the Brereton Inquiry. Those inexperienced reservists killed the 5 children in 2009 and never should have been there in the first place. They seem to have covered up the death of those 5 children in 2009.
There's just one small problem.
Why you might not know it. The government want to disband in the Special Forces another soldier who was not SAS, the non-SAS, and yet the SAS breached rules of engagement, according to the top brass. But it will be written by the military who have got it in for the SAS. They leaked about the Crumfits inquiry because they want to close down the Special Forces.
The reason David thought all of this was happening, the controlled leaks, the vexatious investigations, the Brereton report, was done to push public opinion against the SAS so that Defence could justify disbanding it. Okay, well, he sometimes says Special Forces, but I know from context that he means the SAS specifically. Now this is where we can finally tie everything together. If you'll recall, the Special Forces is an umbrella organisation that controls multiple regiments, like the SAS and the Commandos. This incident is where 2 reservists from the 1st Commando Regiment killed 5 children during a night raid, and David thinks that this was treated differently because they weren't SAS. You might remember back in the beginning where I said I couldn't reconcile the info in his court judgment with an affidavit saying he did intend to expose war crimes. Well, let's reread that. Afghan civilians were being murdered, and Australian military leaders were at the very least turning the other way, and at worst, tacitly approving this behaviour. Yep, that's a bit we've already read. But then, he gives an example of civilians being killed, and what incident does he bring up? The killing of 5 children. But there's more. Former Senator Rex Patrick got a copy of the full affidavit, and he posted some screenshots to Twitter. One difference between the two cases was that the shooting of the boys with donkeys had extensive coverage in the media. We've already seen that one. It was one of the investigations that David thought shouldn't have happened. Whereas in the motorbike incident, there was little or no media coverage. We actually know what the motorcycle incident was because it was in the Afghan files. And guess what? It was a commando. One last thing. Remember when we were talking about those documents that were suppressed as evidence for what turned out to be pretty reasonable reasons? Well, remember when I was leaving the last one for later? It's a briefing to the CDF that contains a quick assessment of a certain incident. We know from the Afghan files that quick assessments are usually reports into killings of civilians. The accused submitted that, given that his IGADF submission contended that the Australian Defence Force had treated complaints inconsistently, as the accused contends consistent with the incident being a dreadful accident arising out of a misunderstanding as to the intended target. They don't tell us exactly what this incident is, but they do say that the briefing was signed on the 13th of March 2013. Do you know what happened on the 9th of March 2013? The motorcycle incident. Alright, you're probably mad at me for stringing you along, showing all this evidence that he didn't intend to expose war crimes, and only now reveal that he did. But look, considering all the evidence that he clearly doesn't really care about war crimes, it seems to me that David was just looking for a couple of whataboutisms to point to and say, ha, look, this shows that defense is biased against the SAS. And the thing about the motorcycle incident is I don't actually think David even believes it's a war crime. Assuming you believe the outcome of the inquiry and the word of the soldiers, things David is very willing to do, they acted within the rules of engagement and their actions were justified. And to be fair to David, from his affidavit, his point seems to just be that there was a double standard with how it was reported to the media. We know from the court judgment that he himself was trying to argue that the incident was a dreadful accident and not a war crime. Oh, and if you were curious, the reason the judge decided to keep these documents redacted was because he could already argue his position with other unredacted documents. So that leaves us with the killing of 5 children. As of 2019, this is literally the only example of a war crime that David thought happened. But not only that, he didn't really try to expose this war crime. It was already publicly reported on by the media. I'm not going to give him credit for just knowing that a war crime happened. I want to know if David actually tried to expose any war crimes, and there is still zero evidence that that happened.
And it went to court, it was fact, and the military judge, who probably had a lot of pressure put on them, acquitted this person effectively. He said, oh, you can never owe a duty of care to an Afghan civilian in a civil war. Basically, you can kill as many Afghan civilians as you want.
This is just not true. I have no idea if the judge said that you can't owe a duty of care to an Afghan. However, it wasn't the judge who dropped the case. It was the prosecution. The director of military prosecutions pressed charges as she had evidence that soldiers knew that there were women and children inside the room, but later dropped the charges because she was provided new evidence that demonstrated their innocence. Plus, from the very start, soldiers involved denied that they committed a war crime, saying he didn't know that there were women and children inside, throwing a grenade after hearing someone fire an automatic weapon at him. Why is it that when it's the SAS, he immediately believes the soldier's story, but in this case, where believing the soldier's story does not fit his narrative, he just assumes they're lying? Plus, the soldiers were frustrated that while the charges were dropped, they weren't formally exonerated. Isn't this exactly what David was complaining the Brereton report would do to the SAS by leaving them on the hook forever? Also keep in mind that I got all this from a 2-part investigation that the ABC did back in 2016, where they got a bunch of new information through Freedom of Information requests. Which is funny, because David complained that the ABC helped to cover this up by not reporting on it.
Now, ABC did not do a story on this, SBS did.
So originally I was going to say that David is partially correct because the Sydney Morning Herald were the only ones to report on it the day it happened, but the ABC still reported on it many times after, including of course in the 2-part investigation. However, as it turns out, David is just flat out wrong. The ABC reported on it 3 times the day after it happened.
That's the worst incident, and Brereton's not looking into that. It's suspicious, isn't it?
Brereton isn't looking into this because doing so would be rehashing an old investigation that had already been done, where the charges were already dropped due to lack of evidence. You know, exactly the thing that David complained about. So there we go. We found one incident that David thought was a war crime, but he holds an egregious double standard to make it fit his narrative that defense are trying to disband the SAS, and it might not have been a war crime anyway. But let's talk about that conspiracy. Did defense do all this to justify the disbanding of the SAS? We'll start with the Crumfits report. If you'll recall, it was a report by an external sociologist, Samantha Crumfits, that brought to attention serious allegations of war crimes in the Special Forces. This is then what prompted the IGADF to begin the Brereton inquiry. David thinks that this was intentionally leaked by defense to justify the disbanding of the SAS.
Some of you might have heard of the Crumfits report, Samantha Crumfits, I can't pronounce it. Now that was leaked to the press and it was highly negative of the Special Forces. It was basically, again, pushing towards the conclusion, which they'd already made, to disband the Special Forces.
I have the full thing right here. So did the Crumfits report push towards the conclusion that we should disband the SAS? Nope.
A good freedom of information would be what was Crumfits' terms of reference. There's no doubt her conclusions were written before her report.
I don't know why writing the conclusion before the report would do anything, because she doesn't really give any recommendations in the conclusion. She just sums up what she's found.
The reality is this: they don't want to finish the inquiry. The Brereton inquiry will never be finished. That's my prediction.
Of course, this prediction was wrong. The Brereton report was finished.
If it is, it'll be top and tailed with the conclusion we need to disband the Special Forces, which was already made.
Alright, I'll let you guess this one. Did the Brereton report come to the conclusion that we should disband the SAS? Nope, of course it didn't. Okay, but did this happen anyway? Did defense disband the SAS? Nope. To be fair, this was considered by the Chief of the Defence Force, but he decided against it. He didn't start with that conclusion and work backwards. He considered it as a result of the Brereton inquiry. And on this controlled leaks conspiracy with the Crumfits report and Ben Robert Smith, why on earth does he think that allegations of war crimes would make the government and defense look better? Does he think the public is going to see this and think, oh, so there was an internal report about allegations of war crimes, and instead of defense coming clean about this, we had to hear about it through a leak to the media? Oh, I am so not mad at the government for this. So someone was committing war crimes under leadership's nose and they somehow didn't know for 4 years? I am so unfurious at defense for this.
Plus, the government is very keen that nobody should blame them for their being aliens.
Would people do that?
Well, they will when the aliens invade and they find out that we've known all along and could have been enlisting support all over the world in an effort to defend against them. There'll be hell to pay then, so...
Yeah, cross that bridge when we come to it.
And some journalists said, why aren't you prosecuting the leaker of the Crumfits report? And the military came back with something which didn't make any sense. They said, oh, because it wasn't classified. It sounds like it was classified. It sounds like the reason you didn't prosecute that leak was because you liked the contents of that leak, but you didn't like the contents of my leak.
It sounds like it was classified. No, it literally wasn't. I have both parts of the fully unredacted report here. Well, of course you do, it was leaked. No, it wasn't. It was leaked to Chris Masters, who then wrote articles about it. But I got these from Defence's official website. Alright, all of this stuff is a little old. It's what he used to believe up until about the beginning of 2020. So what changed? Well, on the 17th of March 2020, Four Corners, the ABC's investigative journalism series, aired Killing Field, a damning look into SAS operations in Afghanistan, and for the first time revealed direct proof of war crimes committed by Australian soldiers. Journalist Mark Willisey was leaked bodycam footage of an SAS mission that included an incident where SAS soldier Oliver Scholes shoots dead an unarmed civilian, right after uttering the infamous line, This footage sent shockwaves throughout Australia. Up until this point, there was a great deal of skepticism about the allegations of war crimes. There was no direct evidence, so many people just dismissed it as jealous soldiers making up allegations against their more decorated peers, or Afghan civilians spreading lies because they hated the Western invasion. But this footage showed that beyond any reasonable doubt, SAS soldiers in Afghanistan murdered civilians. A lot of people changed their minds because of this, including none other than David McBride.
Now, it occurred to me today that I need to set a few things straight, make a few apologies even. While most of my beef with the Defence Force has been with the senior management, some things have come to light which show that no doubt soldiers from the SAS committed war crimes. There's that now famous piece of footage of Soldier C and his famous words, "Do you want me to drop this?" Now, that's unequivocally, that's a war crime, that's a murder.
David finally admits that there were war crimes in the SAS. However, this kind of throws his theory about vexatious investigations being used to justify the disbanding of the SAS into question, which is why David has amended his theory to something more familiar.
The picture's becoming clearer. It's not great for the leadership, I'm afraid. And this is what I believed happened. The leadership knew in 2012 and before. The footage existed. This is not someone coming out of the woodwork. The footage existed and they had access. We don't want to put our most famous decorated soldiers on trial at the end of the war. So what we will do is we will cover it up. We'll put the lid on it. And this is why I got onto them. I saw the cover up, not the crime. But what I saw, because I thought if there was multiple murders of prisoners, I would know about it.
He believes these investigations were done to scapegoat actual war crimes that Defence were covering up. We'll discuss the merits of this new theory later, but for now, I gotta say, if David owned up to the fact that he was wrong and amended his theory in light of new evidence, that's pretty commendable. But you didn't do that, did you, David?
It seemed very strange to me that after a year of very questionable operations, kill counts, complaints being made, complaints that were rejected, because they were complaints against famous soldiers which were rejected. And also in 2013, we're going to chuck guys in jail because press are talking, people are talking about, we need to find some scapegoats. Let's not go after the people who have carried out highly suspicious operations. Let's find someone no one's ever heard of and put him in jail. And there were some things which looked like cold-blooded murders, but they weren't being investigated or that were just being whitewashed. And I was like, well, how can that be? I became concerned that we were covering up war crimes. I made internal complaints. They were ignored.
Okay, look, David doesn't technically lie when he tells his story. However, he is clearly trying to give off the wrong impression. Outside of these two videos with 100 views each, I've never actually seen David admit that he changed his mind. He just talks about this as if he always believed that Defence were doing these investigations to cover up actual war crimes. You'd think that if he originally thought that Defence wanted to disband the SAS, it would be pretty important to tell people. And plus, he's also not technically lying when he says he thought that there was a murder that happened. Of course, the murder of 5 children. But he does not give off the impression of someone who used to think that all of the accusations in the Brereton report were baseless. Were there other murders he thought happened? Maybe, but I've never actually heard him claim to have known about any murders other than the murder of the 5 children. When he's speaking vaguely, he says, oh yeah, there's all these cover-ups and war crimes. But when he gets into specifics, the only one he ever mentions is the murder of 5 children. He's also not talking about it correctly either.
How can you not look into something which looks like children are being killed?
This is obviously not true. It was investigated. The army pressed charges. On top of this, there are times where he does actually just outright lie about what his intentions were.
And the more I looked into it, we found the war crimes eventually, and I gave the classified details to the ABC, which became the Afghan files.
In 2014, I spoke to Chris Masters. I thought he'd say, look, we are scapegoating SAS people when they don't deserve to be. And I think that the reason we're doing that is to cover up some really serious crimes by famous people.
Remember that Chris Masters himself said that David did not intend to expose war crimes. And sometimes he even admits that he didn't blow the whistle on war crimes.
People say I'm not a whistleblower because I'm not a war crimes whistleblower, in the sense that I didn't say I saw Trooper Smith shooting an Afghan, blowing his brains out one day. I didn't, and I never have said that.
I am a whistleblower against the government.
I'm not a war crimes whistleblower, I'm just a whistleblower against the government. How dare the ABC say that I'm not a war crimes whistleblower? This is outrageous. There's also some really funny things about his change of heart. Remember a few years ago when David said Dan wasn't being prosecuted for the Afghan files because he published what the government wanted?
But they're not even charging the journalists who ran the story. Why is that? It's not because they like press freedom, it's because they don't have a problem with the story.
Now that we know that the AFP were investigating Dan Oakes, David now claims that the reason he is because he spoilt Defence's carefully orchestrated narrative to blame the soldiers but not the leadership. But it gets worse. Here he is in February 2020, arguing with the Twitter account for the ADA, once again yapping about how all the incidents in the Brereton inquiry were already looked into, and it's just trying to keep the soldiers on the hook, yada yada yada. Now here, 4 months later, the same Twitter account posts about how the Chief of the Defence Force says there's war crimes, as found by the Brereton inquiry, and David responds, "Thanks for posting, ADA." In his book, he's suspiciously silent about the vexatious investigations. The only two he brings up are the hand incident and the detainee incident that he was involved with. I guess it's not a good look that he defended a soldier who shot a sleeping child, especially since his supporters just assumed that this is one of the incidents he considered a war crime.
One where the Australian Army murdered a man and his child while they were sleeping.
There were also cases that looked murky at best and downright inexcusable at worst. Like when Special Forces guys allegedly shot a man and his 6-year-old son while they were sleeping together under a blanket.
But on top of this, he suddenly has a new war crime accusation. Not a murder, but an alleged torture.
I reported to his brigadier that Afghans were torturing civilians, and I spoke to a guy who'd had his head beaten in with an iron bar till he was unconscious, and then when he woke up again, he got his head beaten in with the iron bar. I got photos of him. We didn't do an investigation, and we should have. In fact, they told me to pretend you never heard it.
Now once again, this doesn't contradict his old narrative, as it's not an accusation against the SAS. However, it is a bit weird that he's only bringing it up now that war crimes are a big part of his public narrative. However, there are some serious red flags. If he believed there was a torture that wasn't being investigated, you'd think he'd include a chapter in his complaint to the IGADF. Plus, this wasn't in the Afghan files, so presumably he didn't send this to Dan Oakes. I doubt he'd skip such a shocking story. In his book, he gives a few more details on the incident. It happened in 2011, and the torture was done by the Afghanistan police before the victim was jailed. The thing is though, this probably wasn't covered up. NATO knew that prisoners were being tortured by Afghans, which is why they stopped the practice of transferring them to Afghan jails. So at the start of the video, I talked about this by YouTuber BoyBoy, and if you're new here, I'm not the biggest fan of this guy. I'm sorry, it's just my anti-Serbian racism. But I just gotta point out, it's kind of embarrassing just how bad this video is. Here's a quick summary of all the mistakes. But the funniest thing about this is just how easy it would have been for Alexa to correct this stuff. The dude is literally sitting right there. He can tell you that some of these things are wrong. Like him claiming that there was only one incident that David thought was being improperly investigated.
A fresh, brand new soldier that could be made an example of, and it was David's job to prosecute him. There was that one soldier that he thought was improperly prosecuted and used as a smokescreen. And David wanted to protect this guy.
There were 5 of these, and David yaps about them all the time. BoyBoy cites David's book in his description, and in that book he talks about 2 of them. He has also apparently read Chris Masters' book, which is really funny, because you might remember that wrong story that David told about Ben Robert Smith.
And then other people came out, probably villagers of the town, and they shot all them as well. When the Defence Force gave him a medal, they turned the one shepherd boy into a Taliban militia force trying to outflank the SAS position.
Chris Masters tells the correct series of events in the first chapter, and if he managed to miss that, he also discusses it later on, including the fact that it was someone on the patrol, not defense, that fabricated events. He even got someone to animate this. Do you think he did the commission first, then read the book and thought, oh fuck, well, I've already paid for it, no one will notice. Also, remember when he said that David knew about Ben Robert Smith's war crimes?
There were some really horrific things in there that David couldn't ignore, like the exploits of Australia's most decorated soldier, Ben Robert Smith.
In Chris's chapter about David McBride, he references an old Facebook post he made that is a mirror of the tweet where he praises Ben Robert Smith before saying that Defence deliberately leaked the accusations against him. But look, as much as I'd want to pick on Alexa, he's not the only one. David's case has been widely misreported across both traditional and new media. But I think this gets to the crux of why David's narrative of being an exposer of war crimes has been so widespread. David talks to people about his case, he usually doesn't lie, but is very dishonest when he speaks. Then, well-meaning authors misrepresent what he's said and report incorrect information, and David just doesn't correct the record or outright praises the work, despite knowing that it contains egregious factual errors. So we've talked about his old theory, and we've talked about his change of heart, but now let's talk about his new theory. Is it true that senior members of defense knew about war crimes, then conducted vexatious investigations to cover them up? Well, to answer that, we'll need to talk about command responsibility. The Brereton inquiry came to the following conclusion. It was at the patrol commander level, the patrol commander is basically the lowest level of command in the SAS, that the criminal behaviour was conceived, committed, continued, and concealed. It is overwhelmingly at that level that responsibility resides. The inquiry has found no evidence that there was knowledge of, or reckless indifference to, the commission of war crimes on the part of commanders at troop platoon, squadron company, basically any level of command above the patrol commander, nor is the inquiry of the view that there was a failure at any of those levels to take reasonable and practical steps that would have prevented or detected the commission of war crimes. I disagree with this conclusion, and no, that's not just my opinion, but we'll get to that later. But before we get to that, let's talk about why it was so difficult for knowledge of these war crimes to ascend the chain of command. Special Forces soldiers would cover up their war crimes in a number of ways. They would use what are called throwdowns, where they would plant evidence, usually a radio, on the victim's body, then take a photo. This would make it look like they had justification to kill them. Under the rules of engagement, things like radios could indicate that the individual might be Taliban. They would also fabricate reports to say they killed someone for a reason. You might remember that someone on Ben Robert Smith's patrol did this when he shot someone at Chora Pass. There was also a lack of video evidence. That camera footage that Mark Wallacey got for Killingfield was a pretty lucky find. The SAS don't have official body cameras. That was from an unofficial camera used by the dog handler, who was dumb enough to keep it around. Special Forces did this a lot, but since it was unofficial, it wasn't shared with the higher-ups. Instead, they edited together Call of Duty montages only with real people.
This is a highlights reel of 3 Squadron's 2012 rotation in Afghanistan. Edited together and set to music by SAS soldiers themselves.
Each individual patrol was also given a great deal of autonomy. Usually the troop commander, the level above patrol, would be located in an overwatch position, where they can't see exactly what the patrol was up to. And lastly, there was an apprehension for members to report their fellow soldiers. Junior troops felt a strong obligation to follow their commander's wishes, going along with the illegal behaviour, else risk their own career. There was also mutually assured destruction, as many, if not most, the people who witnessed war crimes committed some themselves. During the Ben Robert Smith trial, witnesses who testified against him had certificates protecting them from self-incrimination. Can't possibly imagine why. Okay, but do higher levels of leadership still have levels of responsibility? Absolutely. When these murders happened, investigations were launched after complaints from locals. However, these investigations were constantly hampered by leadership in Special Forces who would refuse to cooperate or sometimes outright interfere with the process. Now, to be clear, I am not saying they did this to cover up war crimes. They did this because they had so much trust in their subordinates, they would always just assume they are innocent and didn't want them to be unfairly investigated. And to be fair, the ADF investigative service was not without blame either. They did occasionally not follow proper protocol and ask things of Special Forces that they weren't supposed to. Really, this was a failure all round, where the ADFIS felt their investigations were being hampered, while Special Forces felt their soldiers were being unfairly prosecuted by outsiders who didn't understand how the unit worked. Soldiers being unfairly investigated, that sounds familiar. There are many examples we can point to of leadership failure that led to these crimes going unseen, but you'll see why I bring up this one in particular, because we can now talk about what McBride thinks.
And this is what I believed happened. The leadership knew in 2012 and before.
My case theory is that the government knew about Ben Robert Smith. They knew of the allegations in late 2012 because Andrew Hastie complained about it.
His theory is a pretty tall order. Here's a rundown of the SAS's chain of command. This is a bit of an oversimplification. It's not the same in every Special Forces regiment, and not every squadron in the SAS is like this, but it's close enough. At the bottom, you have the patrol, made up of 5 or 6 people. 4 patrols makes up a troop. There are then 3 troops in a squadron. Then all of the squadrons, of course, belong to the SAS. The SAS is part of Special Operations Task Group. SOTG then reports to the Chief of the Army, who reports to the Chief of the Defence Force. Now, McBride has to prove that not only was the Brereton report wrong and patrol commanders were not the only ones who knew, but that knowledge of these crimes went all the way up to the Chief of the Defence Force.
Footage existing in 2012 would meet the test of Hurley should have known. And Hurley did not prosecute any war crimes. It didn't start any investigations.
So people knew. Now, Hurley tries to maintain that nobody at that very senior level ever passed the information on. Now, it may have just been gossip, that's fine. He would have heard the gossip, he should have started an investigation.
Seriously, it's not good enough for him to just prove that some level of higher leadership might have known. He has to demonstrate that not only did the row amplification, released by CDF David Hurley, and what he claims to be vexatious investigations, initiated by defense leadership, were done because they knew war crimes were taking place, and they tried to cover them up. Is there any evidence for this? Nope. Seriously, this has been investigated by many people both inside and outside of government, and I haven't seen a shred of evidence that knowledge of these crimes went as high as the Chief of the Defence Force. However, that does not mean that the conclusion made by the Brereton report was correct. We know from the Ben Robert Smith trial that there might have been senior officials who may have been at least indifferent to serious allegations of war crimes. One of the allegations, that Ben kicked an Afghan off a cliff, was reported to the Regimental Sergeant Major of the SAS, who dismissed it, effectively saying he didn't know what to do with something like that. The RSM, when testifying, said that he was aware of the more mundane allegations, but not the allegation of war crimes. However, the judge thinks he's either misremembering or lying, and yeah, I agree. He probably didn't investigate because he wanted to avoid either a scandal or repercussions from Ben's supporters. The RSM claims that he reported what he was told up the chain of command, but, wouldn't you know, he can't find the notes. Most likely, the notes don't exist because he didn't report it. So yeah, the Brereton report was probably wrong, and there were people higher up the chain of command who were made aware of allegations of war crimes. However, this is the highest seniority of anyone who did anything like this, and he's not even as high as the commander of the SAS. Now, there was another RSM who had heard the rumours and had asked someone in the SAS about it, but I don't really know where this went. The trial didn't follow up on it. It's possible, however, that this was investigated, but they just couldn't find enough evidence. We know from the Brereton inquiry that this happened occasionally. Leadership was sometimes suspicious that murders had occurred, but they just couldn't find reason to distrust the word of those who were accused. This happened a lot with Robert Smith. The rumours were often dismissed as lies by those jealous of him. A lot of people making these accusations were also angry at him because they felt he didn't deserve some of the awards he was given. But something I need to address. I have been relying fairly heavily on the Brereton inquiry, but some of you may take issue with this given what has come out about Mr. Legay Brereton with regard to his position as Commissioner of the NACC. Now, while this is fairly serious, I don't think it discredits him as an impartial investigator. Basically, there was a conflict of interest when considering who to investigate for the Robodebt scandal, and he only partially recused himself when he should have done so fully. But to be fair, he did accept responsibility. I don't think this significantly throws into questions the findings made by the Brereton inquiry. Yes, he did head the inquiry, but lots of people were involved, with lots of oversight as well. However, I will still take it with a tiny grain of salt, which is why I'm corroborating a lot of the information with media investigations and other reports like the Wetlam report, the Crumfits report, and the Oversight panel. Now, there's a lot of hullabaloo among McBride's supporters over this panel's final report.
And he has been utterly vindicated in the Oversight report by Dr. Vivian Thom, who fundamentally disagreed with the Brereton report conclusion that the leadership of the ADF should get off scot-free for any responsibility for the war crimes in Afghanistan.
Now that the report's been released, we can read it, but honestly, it doesn't vindicate McBride's story. Yes, they are very critical of leadership and the inquiry's conclusion. However, they don't say that leadership knew about the crimes. In fact, quite the opposite. Their point is that they didn't, but they overlooked certain warning signs that should have provoked further scrutiny. And yeah, I agree with this. At every layer of leadership, there was some level of mismanagement or incompetence that led these crimes to go unseen. However, that doesn't mean that defense at the highest level of leadership knew and then conducted vexatious investigations to cover them up. Moreover, it's not just Brereton. The journalists Chris Masters and Nick Mackenzie said that they couldn't find any evidence directly implicating command. But okay, I'll hear McBride out and see what he has to say. Now, McBride yaps about quite a lot of different things, and a lot of the time I can't verify it because it's either information that comes from his case or is non-public information that he learnt from his time in defense. But there are still some things we can learn. For instance, in 2021, McBride said that military insiders told him that we would be in a war with China within 2 years. 2 years after 2021 is of course 2023, so yeah, this prediction didn't really come true. But don't worry, because in 2023, he's now predicting we'll be in a war with China before 2025. You can't make this shit up. Can't wait for this year's prison address.
Mark my words, we will be at war with China before 2027.
Back on track, let's look at the evidence David has to support his theory. We've already been through how David made up a story about defense fabricating the events of a battle. But what else? He's very interested in drone footage.
They've got drone footage of all this. Yeah, and if they wanted to actually put people on trial, they'd use the drone footage. And they don't want to use the drone footage because the drone footage, that shows that they must have known at the time.
Footage existing in 2012 would meet the test of Hurley should have known.
Australian drones filming all the major operations from 2011 onwards. Even Ben Roberts-Smith hasn't mentioned that, strangely enough, because that would exonerate him.
Soldier B, as we'll call him, threw someone off a cliff. Now, that will be captured on drone footage.
McBride believes there must have been drone footage of these incidents, especially the ones involving Ben Roberts-Smith. That means that senior leadership should have known about these crimes, as they should have seen it on the drone footage. However, there's just no evidence that any of these incidents were caught on camera. One of the way patrol commanders would cover up war crimes would be by pushing the drones off target and then make up an excuse as to why they needed to. The Brereton inquiry did review the footage and couldn't find any incidents caught on camera. This came up during the Robert Smith trial and is confirmed by the oversight panel, the report that supposedly vindicates McBride's narrative.
Now, one of the things he says, he saw footage of an SAS patrol where a guy called Scott Smith lost his life to an IED. Masters says there's footage of that scene. That means there's footage of everything else about that time. That is pretty conclusive proof from Chris Masters' book that Australians and Americans had drones operating over all the SAS operations 2012.
So there was footage of one very specific incident, completely unrelated, that wasn't a war crime, therefore there is footage of everything? Congrats, you've figured out that drones exist. David does this a lot. He's always grasping at straws, looking for any evidence that supports his position.
The people from the SAS had complained to the leadership. In fact, back in 2006, one brave SAS operator complained about Ben Roberts-Smith's behaviour when he got his Medal of Gallantry.
Oh, so someone made a complaint about Ben's war crimes in 2006?
And there were more complaints, I think, around the award of the Victoria Cross.
People also complained in 2012? Or take this tweet, where he says that leadership must have known about Ben's war crimes as early as 2013, because there was an internal investigation. But if you actually read the article that he cites, it was just an allegation of bullying. This is the 2006 complaint he was talking about before. As for the 2012 complaint surrounding the VC award, that was, once again, not about war crimes. Certain soldiers were upset that Ben received the Victoria Cross, despite others having an equal or greater contribution to the Battle of Tazak. I could really go on. He makes these bizarre and unfounded accusations all the time. I'd go through them all, but I've already dragged the video length out long enough, so we should move on. Another important part of his case is the supposed inconsistency with which incidents defense investigated.
Again, we didn't investigate Ben Robert Smith's patrol, not once, but we investigated this guy with a vengeance to try to put him in jail for murder. And that was when I was over there. And that's actually what first started me to say, hang on.
It was a mistake, unfortunate. But defence investigated that as a murder. That was in 2013, and that was after there's all these 10 incidents of real murders. And that's suspicious.
Putting aside the fact that, as I've said before, these supposed vexatious investigations were actually pretty reasonable, they were not the only incidents investigated. He says that in 2012, the military police did not conduct any investigations. However, we know that the ADF did investigate the murder seen in Killingfield. They just couldn't prove it at the time because they didn't have the video footage. Plus, we don't really know that the incidents that David didn't want investigated were not actually war crimes, because once again, you just have to take the soldier's word for it. But look, he is still absolutely right that the allegations against Ben Robert Smith should have been taken more seriously, even if they were just second or third hand. But you know who else dismissed the rumours against him? David McBride. He even later said that he didn't pay much attention to the rumours.
But as a lawyer, you don't pay too much attention to the rumours.
And once again, allegations must be investigated. Here's a hypothetical. Let's say a soldier kills someone, but the bullet ricochets and, tragically, kills a nearby sleeping child. According to the soldier, the person he shot was armed, but according to an Afghan civilian, he wasn't armed and he was just a civilian. Is the soldier telling the truth? Is the Afghan telling the truth? Who knows? That's why he launched an investigation. Wait a minute.
That was a case where we shot a child. No new evidence can come out of that. The chances that you're proving that the shooter purposely shot this small boy, there was nothing to suggest that. He was trying to shoot the father, and he was trying to shoot the father because he thought he was a threat.
Seriously, David was part of the exact same chain of command failure that led to these crimes going unseen for so long. Like I said before, officers in special forces would hamper or interfere with external investigations, and this included legal officers. Remember, David literally told his superior not to hand over evidence to the ADFIS. But to be clear, I am not accusing David of trying to cover up war crimes. In fact, quite the opposite. If McBride thinks that this adversity to investigating war crimes was evidence that they were trying to cover them up, then by that logic, he himself should have known about these war crimes. Really, the reason was a completely undue trust in SAS soldiers. No one could have conceived that Australia's most elite regiment would have done something so heinous. So their superiors thought they were doing what was right by protecting them from what they considered ADFIS inquisitions. Great example of this undue trust: a legal officer praising a soldier who would later be proven a war criminal in court. Speaking of David's strangely different old views, there's something that still bugs me. David admitted that he was wrong about the SAS after seeing video evidence of a war crime, and while this would explain a narrow change in view, it doesn't explain this strange and abrupt change in narrative where he's now making being an exposer of war crimes his primary focus, while tacitly rewriting history. Is there something else that can explain this? Yes, there is. On the 17th of March 2020, one day after the release of Killingfield, it is publicly announced that Xenophon Davis Law will represent McBride for his defence. XD Law is a firm founded by former politician Nick Xenophon, famous for his illustrious publicity stunts like bringing a goat and a literal gravy train to Parliament, or turning his campaign ads into musicals.
We're the best, we're SA best. Come on and put us to the test.
His partner-in-law is Mark Davis, a former journalist who did work for SBS Dateline and ABC's Four Corners. You might remember him as the lawyer who represents Friendly Geordies through his many legal controversies. Now these two have been big pushers of McBride's new narrative, selling him as the whistleblower who uncovered war crimes at any opportunity.
He became aware of serious systemic issues with our defence forces, issues that he raised in terms of unlawful killing of civilians, unarmed adults, unarmed children.
I love the sentence. Genuinely impressive mental gymnastics. It would of course be a lie to say that he raised issues of unlawful killings, so instead he raised allegations in terms of it. His complaints just surrounded war crimes. You might also remember that 2 million view Boy Boy video with blatant factual errors about his client. Well, XD Law cited it as a great example of how video can convey complex stories. Now I need to be very clear with what I'm about to say. I do not know this for certain. This is just speculation and my opinion. You could even say it's my honest opinion based on proper documents. I think it's possible that sometime between David approaching XD Law and them going public, they said to him, "Look, David, this stuff about soldiers being hamstrung by investigations isn't going to gel well with the public. Remember that killing of 5 children you thought was a crime? What if we lent into that and made you the whistleblower who exposed war crimes revealed in the Afghan files?" But once again, I do not know this for certain, this is just my opinion. I think it's time to bring this all full circle. Remember that Four Corners episode that revealed that David did not intend to expose war crimes? His legal team made a public statement about it. Yes, David did defend soldiers wrongly accused of war crimes. He remains proud to have done so, and those innocent men are grateful to him. This was part of the material given to him in a shopping bag to Dan Oakes, and McBride was disappointed that the ABC did not wish to publish it. This is patently untrue. All 5 investigations that David didn't want to happen were discussed in the Afghan files. But is this an intentional lie to make David look better, or just a mistake? Well, they would have known about these investigations, and surely at some point they would have read the Afghan files. How did no one at any point correct them on this? If it wasn't intentional, this law firm is embarrassingly bad at their job. And as for the incidents that David did think were war crimes, I don't know. Seriously, he's never actually claimed to have thought that any of the incidents in the Afghan files were war crimes. I have literally only ever heard him claim to know about 2 war crimes while he was in the SAS. There was the murder of 5 children, but he didn't expose that. It was already public knowledge at the time, and it wasn't in the Afghan files. Then there was his very bizarre claim about a torture of a prisoner, but that was also not in the Afghan files. He didn't need to write war crimes in texter across the top of these files. The inappropriateness was self-evident without him writing memos or post-it notes. This is the explanation that Mark Davis gave to Four Corners.
It's apparent within the material by the virtue of giving it, by the act of giving it, he wants someone to do something with it.
This would have been a very bizarre thing for David to have done. Why would you give a journalist thousands of documents to pour through, but not tell them why you were making them do it? Dan Oakes knows almost nothing about David McBride, now or then. They only met once to discuss the material. He is not in a position to be pontificating now on David's motivations or internal thought processes at the time. This isn't exactly true. They only met for 1 day, but on 2 separate occasions. First at his house to discuss the documents, and presumably his motivations, then later that day at a hotel to actually hand over the documents. On top of this, Daniel had read his website and they communicated over Signal. There were many opportunities for David to have explained to Daniel what his intentions were. Not only that, but David admitted in a police statement that Daniel understood his intentions. But I met Dan Oakes and I gave him all the materials. So again, he was very enthusiastic, and again, he seemed to get it. There was also this. He calls me and he says, "I'm going to run a story. It's going to be very damning. It's going to say the SAS kill people unnecessarily. I'm going to use this other witness, a total opposite to what you've said. I'm just warning you." There is of course Chris Masters, who said the same thing. There is absolutely no way that both these journalists somehow missed that he wanted to expose war crimes. They have largely ignored his story ever since. They totally ignored our request for evidence that they held, which was vital to David's defense. Oh, I've heard this one before.
When they asked the ABC for evidence to help his case, they refused to cooperate, which was confusing.
Someone asked the lawyers if they tried getting the documents subpoenaed, and according to them, this didn't work because of journalistic privilege and source protection. Now, in case you didn't know, journalistic privilege protects journalists from being compelled to give evidence that would have revealed one of their sources. And since McBride was already revealed as one of their sources, it kinda seems to me like his lawyers tried to ask for evidence that would have revealed the identity of another one of the ABC's sources. I want to step back for a second and talk about McBride as a person. David has long said that he respects people who take responsibility for their mistakes.
Now, what was really good about this is defence issued a statement and said, yeah, look, it looks like that's fact, we did it, we're sorry about that. Now, that's all I've ever wanted them to do.
Dusty Miller, who I think is a very credible witness, he blames himself and he says, I should have done more. That has the ring of truth about it to me. But I did think it was good that he accepted some responsibility.
This is an admirable quality, but how does David live up to it? We've already been through how he didn't properly own up to being wrong about war crimes in the SAS. But what else? In 2002, David ran with the Liberal Party for the seat of Coogee. If you look up news articles, they will say that he's in the British SAS. However, he admitted that he failed SAS selection twice in his book. Did he lie about making it during his campaign? He defends himself in his book, saying that someone leaked the incorrect information to a newspaper and he just didn't correct them. A journalist from the Sunday Telegraph picked up on this, so he called McBride to set the record straight. McBride claims he didn't lie about being in the SAS in his original paperwork, but the Sunday Telegraph claimed he did. So is McBride being unfairly smeared by the Sunday? Or is this McBride once again not taking responsibility for his actions? This was actually a hard find, but I managed to get a copy of the Sunday Telegraph article, and this is what it says. Mr. McBride, who is standing for the state seat of Coogee, told Liberal pre-selectors that in 1992 he had been promoted to captain and selected for training with the elite Special Air Service Regiment, the anti-terrorist and covert operations arm of the British Army. He said he had passed the most demanding physical entry requirements of their kind in the world, and served in Northern Ireland. He even sent party members a letter from Federal Employment Minister and old friend Tony Abbott. Yeah, that's right, he used to be friends with Tony Abbott, who wrote that Mr. McBride joined the British Army and served in elite units, including the SAS, in some of the world's trouble spots. So what he told pre-selectors was clearly framed to make them think he was in the SAS. He shared with party members a letter that wrongly said he was, then the media reported on this and he made no attempt to correct the record. Yeah, while he didn't technically lie, he was clearly trying to mislead people. The author, Kevin Foster, wrote a book review of David's autobiography, giving what were some fairly light criticisms of McBride as a person. David was not a fan of this, so he went on a tirade accusing him of being paid by the Defense Department.
We're trying to establish whether the Department of Defence paid a certain Melbourne academic in order to defame me. A man that never wore a uniform, criticising those that put their life on the line for the country. Anyway, we need to find out whether he was paid.
This guy is literally just some random academic who reviews military books. And Kevin is far from the only person who David has smeared like this. You might remember when David took his complaint to the AFP, who dismissed it, saying that there wasn't enough evidence of a criminal offence. David, of course, couldn't accept that he was just wrong and his complaint didn't have merit, so instead he said that the AFP told him, if the government does something, it can't be illegal. This is part of a long pattern of behaviour, where David can never admit that he's wrong or that people might just disagree with him. Everything has to be part of some grand conspiracy against him. He once claimed that the psychiatrist appointed to him was sent by the defence to gaslight him into not becoming a whistleblower. He was actually diagnosed with PTSD, by the way. In fact, his own legal team tried to argue that his sentence should be reduced because he was going through mental health issues while making the disclosures. But of all the people he's attacked, the one who suffered the most was investigative journalist Dan Oakes. Dan knew that David didn't want to expose war crimes, and that his public narrative was not accurate. He might have even known that David was smearing him in public. Despite this, Dan still went to bat for him because he was his source and it was his duty to protect him.
And as you say, it is quite extraordinary that the only person so far who's been charged is the person who has spoken up about alleged war crimes having been committed.
While I'm obviously happy that Sam and I are not going to be subject to prosecution, there is somebody else, David McBride, who is facing charges over this matter as we speak. This matter is certainly not over. It will continue to roll on. And I think it's very, very important that everybody remember that.
The AFP asked him to hand over documents that would have implicated McBride. He refused. They then asked him to self-search for them. Refused again. The only way the AFP were going to get the documents was if they came in through the front door and searched for it themselves. The Afghan Files is an incredible piece of work that discloses to the Australian people the inner workings of the Special Forces, including investigations into war crimes, a culture of desensitisation, and dangerously toxic norms. But it's not the only work he's done. He contributed to the Ben Robert Smith story, and even exposed the fact that soldiers were flying a swastika in Afghanistan. He's almost as good of a journalist as Tyler Oliveira. And what did he get for all this? Well, when he just told the truth on four corners, you know, the thing he had the right to do the whole time, his reputation, his work, and his moral character were all smeared by McBride's supporters. He then got harassed on Twitter to the point where he had to private his account for a while. If you read David's book, you'll realize that his life is just kind of sad. He's always been in pursuit of something great, but failed every single time. He couldn't get into the SAS, his reality TV career went nowhere, and he lost his election in Coogee. He's always lived in his father's shadow, who actually did do something great, although that valor was short-lived. David's latest attempt at greatness has been becoming a whistleblower. He's a big fan of stories like Watergate or the Washington Post expose on the Afghan war. But he's not motivated by a genuine desire to expose wrongdoing. He just wants to break the next big scandal, so he grasps at straws trying to find one, while ironically missing a huge story right under his nose. Wait a minute, he's the Dogpack 404 of Australia. This video has taken me quite a while. I promise you that this joke was relevant when I recorded it.
And thanks to David's bravery, nothing happened. All the war criminals and generals are free, all the politicians are free. Like, it's the death of whistleblower laws. They made sure the big guys got the message that journalism is dead. And our democratic institutions that are meant to keep the government in check are completely at their disposal.
This is dangerous for democracy, and I'm not even going into the chilling effect it'll have on future whistleblowers.
Look, I understand the proclivity to frame this whole saga as some huge failing of our institutions, but I don't think that's quite accurate. To be clear, by no means was the government's response perfect. The Brereton inquiry took too long, did not apply ample criticism of leadership, and has led to very limited prosecution. However, this whole saga was not started by a whistleblower or a media expose. I do think we should step back and appreciate the fact that Australia is a country where its own government investigates its own military's war crimes. We don't need to wait for the UN to do that for us. And plus, while criminal prosecutions are limited, that doesn't mean they're not happening. Oliver Schultz, the one who was caught committing a murder on camera, has been charged, and it's possible that more are on the way. But to be fair to the AFP, I don't think it's really their fault. They've been hampered by evidentiary issues that limits their ability to prove the accusations beyond reasonable doubt. Take Ben Roberts-Smith, for example. The AFP had a 5-year probe on him, but later decided it wouldn't lead to a prosecution because of weird legal stuff about how a lot of the information gotten from the Brereton inquiry can't be used as evidence. That's why instead they started a new task force to collect new evidence that hasn't been prejudiced. So yeah, hopefully that works. But what about whistleblowers and journalistic freedom? Well, now that Dan Oakes has been exonerated, every single journalist who has published stories on this issue has been left untouched by the law. Outside of the war crime saga, a certain party has dropped the charges against Bernard Collaery and successfully advocated for Julian Assange to be free. Plus, every single person who disclosed allegations of war crimes to the media has gone home scot-free. The only war crimes whistleblower to be imprisoned is a dishonest, opportunistic fraud who wanted to mislead the public into thinking we should investigate murders less instead of more. Wow, that was a cool story. I really hope I don't have to reevaluate everything I know about every other whistleblower. Witness K? Is that even his real name? That's all from me, but I just have one more thing to say to you, Mr. McBride.
You are on this council.
But we do not grant you the rank of whistleblower. Thanks for watching.